Boarding passes crumpled in sweaty hands. Children cried softly, clutching small backpacks. A powerful airline executive sneered, pointing toward an exit door. He demanded complete compliance, stripping away dignity from an innocent family. He thought he possessed absolute authority. He targeted David and Sarah simply because they didn't fit his narrow worldview of first-class passengers. Hubris blinded him. Arrogance clouded his judgment. He never noticed a quiet, older gentleman watching from seat 1A. That quiet man owned every plane in sight. Karma approaches rapidly. This executive's career is about to end abruptly. Chicago O'Hare International Airport was a chaotic symphony of rolling luggage, frantic announcements, and the dull roar of tens of thousands of travelers rushing to their gates. But for David and Sarah Hayes, the typical airport anxiety was entirely absent. Today was a milestone. It was their 10th wedding anniversary, and they were embarking on a meticulously planned 2-week European vacation with their 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, and 5-year-old son, Leo. David, a senior software architect, and Sarah, a dedicated pediatrician, had saved for over 3 years for this specific trip. They had spared no expense, booking 4 first-class tickets on Global Horizon Airlines, Flight 402, directly to London Heathrow. For the children, the sheer size of the Boeing 777 waiting outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Terminal 5 was awe-inspiring. "Look at the engines, Daddy." Leo pressed his small face against the glass, his breath fogging the pain. "They're huge, buddy," David smiled, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. He glanced at Sarah, who was holding their passports and first-class boarding passes. Her eyes met his, reflecting a shared, quiet triumph. As a black family traversing spaces that were historically, and often currently, gate-kept by unspoken societal rules, occupying premium spaces sometimes came with lingering glances. But today, their joy was an impenetrable shield. Boarding commenced with the standard priority announcements. The Hayes family gathered their carry-ons and strolled down the jet bridge, greeted at the aircraft door by a warm, professional flight attendant named Jessica Barnes. "Welcome aboard. Row 2, right this way." "Oh, look at these 2 eager travelers," Jessica beamed, handing Chloe and Leo small plastic pilot wing pins. The family settled into their sprawling, private pods. The champagne was poured for the adults, warm nuts were distributed, and the vacation had officially begun. However, outside the serene bubble of the first-class cabin, a storm of arrogance and bureaucracy was brewing at the gate podium. Richard Sterling, the regional director of passenger operations for Global Horizon Airlines, was having a terrible afternoon. Richard was a man who wore his authority like a heavy, suffocating cologne. He was 52, impeccably groomed, and possessed a deeply ingrained belief that his position elevated him above the general public. He was currently hovering over a stressed gate agent, his face flushed with irritation. "What do you mean Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore are not on the manifest?" Richard hissed, adjusting his expensive silk tie. The young gate agent swallowed hard, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Sir, they missed their connection from Dallas. Their seats were automatically forfeited by the system 45 minutes ago when they didn't scan in. The seats were then reassigned." "Reassigned? To whom?" Richard demanded. The Whitmores were close, personal friends of Richard's, wealthy socialites whose influence in Chicago's upper crust Richard frequently leveraged for personal gain. He had promised them a seamless upgrade to London. "They weren't upgrades, Mr. Sterling. The flight is completely full. First class is sold out. Everyone in the cabin is a confirmed, revenue-paying passenger," the agent explained nervously. Richard scoffed, turning the monitor to view the seating chart. "There has to be a mistake. Look at row 2. Who are the Hayes?" "A family of 4, sir. Fully paid. Booked 6 months in advance." Richard's eyes narrowed. He looked down the jet bridge, then back at the screen. In his mind, an elitist calculus was forming. A family of 4 in first class, probably lottery winners, or perhaps they booked through some discounted third-party glitch. They certainly didn't hold the platinum elite global status that the Whitmores did. More importantly, Richard needed those seats to save face with his affluent friends, who were currently standing at the edge of the terminal lounge, looking deeply displeased. "Downgrade them," Richard ordered flatly. "Sir, I can't do that," the gate agent gasped. "They are fully ticketed, boarded and seated. Furthermore, economy is completely overbooked. If we pull them from first class, we have to bump them off the flight entirely." "Then bump them," Richard snapped, his tone devoid of any empathy. "Tell them there was an equipment change. Tell them there was a ticketing error. I don't care what excuse you use. I want those 4 seats cleared, cleaned, and prepped for the Whitmores in exactly 5 minutes. Mr. Sterling, that violates several DOT regulations regarding involuntary denial of boarding, especially since they are already seated." "I am the regional director," Richard interrupted, leaning in so close the agent could smell his peppermint breath mints. "I write the policies for this hub. You will print the cancellation slips, or you will be looking for a new job by the time this plane pushes back. Am I understood?" With trembling hands, the gate agent printed the involuntary offload vouchers. Richard snatched them from the printer. He straightened his jacket, pasted on a severe, authoritative expression, and marched down the jet bridge. He was about to make a monumental miscalculation, blinded by his own prejudice and perceived invincibility. Inside the cabin, David was showing Leo how the entertainment screen folded out of the armrest when a sharp throat clearing broke his concentration. David looked up to see Richard Sterling standing over his pod. Richard's posture was rigid, his expression conveying a practiced mixture of corporate regret and absolute disdain. "Excuse me. Mr. Hayes, I presume?" Richard asked, his voice projecting just enough to draw the attention of the surrounding passengers. "Yes. Can I help you?" David replied, offering a polite but cautious smile. "I am Richard Sterling, Regional Director of Operations. I'm afraid there has been a critical system error regarding your ticketing. You and your family will need to gather your belongings and deplane immediately." Sarah, sitting across the aisle, paused her conversation with Chloe and leaned over. "Deplane? What do you mean? We've been booked for 6 months. We have our boarding passes right here." Richard waved a dismissive hand, not even bothering to look at the documents Sarah held up. "Paperwork errors happen, madam. The reality is that this cabin is over capacity due to a routing irregularity, and your seats are required for priority passengers. I must ask you to exit the aircraft so we can depart on time." David's protective instincts flared, but he kept his voice steady and calm. He knew exactly how situations like this could be spun if a black man raised his voice. "Mr. Sterling, we are not on standby. We paid full fare for these specific seats. If the airline overbooked, you need to ask for volunteers. You cannot legally remove a boarded, revenue-paying family to make room for someone else." Richard's face tightened. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by someone he had already subconsciously categorized as lesser. "Mr. Hayes, I am not asking for volunteers. I am informing you of a management decision. Your tickets have been invalidated. If you wish to argue airline policy, you may do so at the customer service desk in Terminal 3. Now, please, the children." Jessica, the flight attendant who had welcomed them, stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, sir," she whispered urgently. "These passengers are entirely legitimate. I checked their tags myself. There is no equipment change. Return to your galley, Miss Barnes, or you will join them on the tarmac." Richard hissed out of the corner of his mouth. Jessica stepped back, her face pale with shock and helplessness. Richard turned back to David, his tone growing more condescending. "Look, let's not make a scene in front of the proper clientele in this cabin. Perhaps a budget carrier would better suit your family's travel style. But on Global Horizon, we must prioritize our high-tier, loyal investors." The blatant microaggression hung heavy in the conditioned air of the cabin. A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A businessman in row 3 lowered his newspaper, frowning at the exchange. Sarah felt a hot flash of indignation. "Our money spends exactly the same as anyone else's, Mr. Sterling. You are profiling us, and you are lying about a system error. We are not moving." "Mummy, why is that man yelling at us?" Chloe whispered, shrinking back into her oversized leather seat. Hearing his daughter's fear snapped something deep inside David, but he maintained his iron grip on his composure. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and hit record. "Mr. Sterling, I am recording this interaction. I want you to state clearly, on camera, why a fully paid family of 4 is being forcibly removed from this flight after boarding." Richard's eyes widened with fury at the sight of the camera. "Put that away. Unauthorized photography is a violation of airline security protocols." "I am documenting a consumer dispute," David replied evenly. "Now please explain the policy." "I don't need to explain anything to you," Richard sneered, his veneer of professionalism entirely cracking. He reached for his radio. "Gate desk, this is Sterling. Get O'Hare Law Enforcement down to the aircraft immediately. I have a disruptive passenger refusing crew instructions." Sarah gasped. "Disruptive? We are sitting quietly in our seats. You are trespassing on a commercial aircraft," Richard retorted, crossing his arms. He looked down at David with a smug, triumphant smirk. "You have 2 choices, Mr. Hayes. You can walk off this plane with whatever dignity you have left, or you can be escorted off in handcuffs in front of your children. Your call." The ultimatum was a sickening blow. David looked at his wife, whose eyes were filled with unshed tears of frustration. He looked at Leo and Chloe, both of whom were now clutching their stuffed animals, terrified by the sudden hostility. David knew he was right. He knew the law. But he also knew the grim reality of America. He knew how quickly a situation with law enforcement could escalate, and he would absolutely not risk his children witnessing their father being violently dragged off an airplane. With a heavy, breaking heart, David lowered his phone. "We'll go," he said quietly. "A wise choice," Richard mocked, stepping aside and gesturing toward the exit door like a bouncer, tossing patrons from a nightclub. The walk from row 2 to the aircraft door felt like miles. David carried their 2 heavy duffel bags, while Sarah held firmly to Chloe and Leo's hands. The silence in the first-class cabin was deafening. Some passengers looked away out of guilt. Others watched with morbid curiosity. As they stepped off the plane and onto the slanted floor of the jet bridge, 2 armed airport police officers were just arriving. "Is there a problem here?" the lead officer, a burly man named Miller, asked, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. "No problem, officer," Richard announced loudly, following the family out of the plane and standing in the doorway. "These passengers were denied travel due to aggressive non-compliance. They are being rebooked. You can escort them up to the terminal." "We weren't aggressive," Sarah said, her voice shaking with adrenaline and sorrow. "He bumped us for his friends." "Keep moving," Richard barked, stepping fully onto the jet bridge and pulling the heavy metal door of the aircraft partially closed behind him. He walked over to the gate podium, where the terrified gate agent was still standing. Richard slapped the Hayes family's boarding passes onto the counter. "Cancel their itinerary entirely," Richard commanded the agent. "Flag their profiles. I want them banned from Global Horizon for 6 months for threatening an airline executive. "Mr. Sterling, you can't do that!" David yelled, finally letting his anger surface. "You ruined our anniversary, you terrified my kids, and now you're stealing our money. I will sue you and this airline into the ground." Richard laughed, a cold, grating sound. He leaned against the podium, completely relaxed, relishing his absolute control over the situation. "Sue us? Good luck, Mr. Hayes. We have armies of corporate lawyers who drag these things out for decades. The contract of carriage gives me broad discretion to deny boarding to anyone who causes a disturbance. And since I am the ranking official here, my word is law. You are nothing to this company." Richard turned his back on them, dismissing them entirely, and smiled warmly as his friends, the Whitmores, finally ambled down the ramp, completely oblivious to the trauma they were replacing. "Ah, Greg, Diane, right this way. So sorry for the delay. I had to clear out some technical garbage from the system. Your seats are ready." As the Whitmores brushed past the devastated Hayes family, David pulled Sarah and the kids into a tight embrace. The injustice was a physical weight, crushing the breath out of them. Leo began to cry loudly, the stress finally breaking his small limits. But back inside the first-class cabin, a different sequence of events had been unfolding. In seat 1A, directly in front of where the Hayes family had been sitting, sat an older gentleman. He wore a well-worn tweed sports coat, simple khaki trousers, and a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Throughout the entire ordeal, he had not said a word. He had not intervened when Richard raised his voice. He had simply watched, his piercing blue eyes tracking every movement, every threat, every abuse of power. His name was Arthur Kensington. To the casual observer, Arthur looked like a retired college professor traveling on a pension. In reality, Arthur Kensington was a self-made billionaire and the notoriously private CEO of Kensington Holdings. Exactly 3 months ago, Kensington Holdings had quietly finalized the acquisition of Vanguard Aviation Group, the parent company of Global Horizon Airlines. Arthur hated corporate pomp. He despised yes-men. When he acquired a new company, he made a habit of traveling on their services incognito, observing the frontline operations and the corporate culture from the ground level. He wanted to see how the lowest-paid employees were treated, and more importantly, how the customers were treated when the executives thought nobody important was watching. He had just seen enough. As Richard Sterling strutted back toward the plane to personally escort his friends aboard, Arthur slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up, his joints popping slightly, and stepped into the aisle. Jessica, the flight attendant, was standing near the galley, wiping away a tear. "Excuse me, miss," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly deep and resonant for a man of his slight build. "Could you hold that door open for me? I need to stretch my legs." "Sir, we're about to close the door for pushback," Jessica said politely. "I assure you we are not," Arthur replied calmly. He walked to the front of the aircraft. Richard Sterling was just stepping through the threshold, beaming at his friends. Arthur placed a firm hand on the heavy metal door, stopping Richard in his tracks. "Excuse me, sir, you need to take your seat," Richard ordered, his tone immediately reverting to annoyed superiority. "We are departing." Arthur looked at Richard, his eyes devoid of any warmth. "No, Mr. Sterling, we are not." Arthur stepped past the arrogant manager, walking out onto the jet bridge where the Hayes family was huddled with the police officers and where the gate agent was typing through tears. The sudden appearance of the old man in the tweed jacket made everyone freeze. Arthur walked directly past Richard and approached David and Sarah. He looked down at Leo and Chloe, offering them a gentle, reassuring smile. "I apologize for the delay," Arthur said to David, extending his hand. "My name is Arthur. I believe those seats in row 2 belong to you." Richard spun around, his face turning crimson. "Hey, who the hell do you think you are? Get back on the plane, or I'll have security arrest you, too." Arthur slowly turned to face Richard. He reached into the inner pocket of his tweed jacket and pulled out a simple, black leather wallet. He didn't produce a ticket. He produced a sleek, solid metal card bearing the gold crest of Kensington Holdings. "My name is Arthur Kensington," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space of the jet bridge. "And to answer your question, Mr. Sterling, I own the plane." The silence that fell over the jet bridge was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the enclosed space. The hum of the terminal ventilation and the distant roar of jet engines faded into the background. For a few agonizingly long seconds, nobody moved. Richard Sterling stared at the solid metal card in Arthur Kensington's hand. His brain, usually quick to formulate excuses and manipulate corporate jargon, completely stalled. He recognized the name Kensington Holdings. Every executive in the Vanguard Aviation Group had heard the whispered rumors over the past 3 months about a quiet, aggressive buyout by a notoriously strict private equity billionaire. They had all been waiting for the axe to fall, for the restructuring to begin. Richard had assumed the restructuring would target the lower-level staff, the mechanics, the flight attendants, never the untouchable regional management. This is a joke," Richard finally stammered, his voice lacking its previous booming resonance. The color was rapidly draining from his impeccably tanned face. He looked from Arthur to the card and back again, a sick feeling blooming in the pit of his stomach. "Vanguard Aviation is an independent entity. You can't possibly—" "Vanguard Aviation was an independent entity, Mr. Sterling, until my board finalized the acquisition at 9 o'clock this morning. The press release goes out at the closing bell today," Arthur stated, slipping the card back into his tweed jacket. His voice remained incredibly calm, devoid of shouting, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "I own the holding company. I own this airline. I own the very gate podium you are leaning against. And I have just spent the last 20 minutes watching you dismantle the core values of my newly acquired company." Arthur turned his attention to the terrified gate agent, whose hands were still shaking over her keyboard. "Young lady, what is your name?" Brenda, sir," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Brenda, you have done absolutely nothing wrong today. In fact, you attempted to uphold federal aviation regulations in the face of blatant intimidation," Arthur said gently, offering her a reassuring nod. "I want you to immediately reinstate the Hayes family's original boarding passes. Disregard the involuntary offload vouchers." "Yes, Mr. Kensington. Right away." Brenda's fingers flew across the keyboard with renewed frantic energy, tears of relief pricking her eyes. Richard's survival instincts finally kicked in, overriding his shock. He stood up straight, desperately trying to salvage his shattered authority. "Sir, you must understand. I was handling a delicate situation. The system glitched. These passengers were being uncooperative. I had to make an executive decision to prioritize our high-value clients. The Whitmores are platinum elite." "Stop talking, Richard," Arthur cut him off, his voice slicing through the air like a razor. "Do not insult my intelligence by lying to my face. I was sitting in seat 1A. I heard your entire conversation with the flight attendant. I watched you deliberately manufacture a false narrative to illegally eject a paying family simply because they didn't match your archaic, prejudiced vision of what a first-class passenger should look like. You weaponized your authority to impress your friends." At the mention of their names, Greg and Diane Whitmore, who had been lingering uncomfortably a few paces away, suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. Greg, a wealthy real estate developer used to getting his way, stepped forward attempting to smooth things over with the familiarity of a fellow millionaire. "Now, see here, Arthur," Greg began, forcing a hearty chuckle. "Let's not blow this out of proportion. Richard was just doing us a solid. We had a miserable delay in Dallas, and he was simply taking care of his loyal customers. A little shuffling of the deck, that's all. No harm, no foul, right?" Arthur turned his piercing blue eyes onto Greg Whitmore. The temperature on the jet bridge seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Mr. Whitmore, I do not know you, and I certainly do not consider you a peer," Arthur said coldly. "You stood by and willingly participated in the theft of another family's vacation to benefit yourself. Your platinum elite status does not grant you the right to strip innocent people of their dignity. As of this moment, your status with this airline is permanently revoked." Diane Whitmore gasped, clutching her designer handbag. "You can't do that. We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year with Global Horizon. And I have billions of dollars at my disposal, madam. I assure you, my airline will survive without your patronage," Arthur replied, without missing a beat. He looked back at Brenda. "Brenda, please ensure the Whitmores are removed from this flight manifest entirely. Do not rebook them. They can find their own way to London on a competitor's aircraft." "This is an outrage!" Greg yelled, his face flushing red. "Richard, are you going to let him talk to us like this?" Richard was visibly trembling now. The sweat was beading on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He looked frantically at the two police officers, Officer Miller and his partner, who were standing by silently. The dynamic had shifted so violently that the officers had holstered their radios, realizing the disruptive passengers were the victims of a rogue executive. "Officers," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking. "This man is interfering with airport operations. You need to remove him." Officer Miller crossed his arms over his chest, a look of profound disgust on his face. He looked at Richard, then at Arthur, and finally at David Hayes, who was still holding his daughter tightly. "Mr. Sterling," Officer Miller said slowly, "from where I'm standing, the only person interfering with operations is you. We were called here under false pretenses. You lied to airport police to force a family off a plane. That's a misuse of emergency services, which is a misdemeanor in this jurisdiction." Arthur nodded approvingly at the officer. "Thank you, Officer Miller. I appreciate your discernment." Arthur then turned the full weight of his attention back to Richard. The corporate execution was about to commence. "Richard Sterling," Arthur proclaimed, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. "You have demonstrated a catastrophic lack of judgment, a shocking abuse of power, and a blatant disregard for basic human decency. You are a liability to my brand and a disgrace to the uniform you wear. You are terminated, effective immediately." You can't just fire me on a jet bridge," Richard shouted, panic completely overtaking him. "I have a contract. I have stock options. I'll call the union. I'll call my lawyers." "You are an at-will, C-suite regional executive," Arthur corrected him effortlessly, knowing the corporate bylaws by heart. "Your contract explicitly states that you can be terminated for cause, specifically for violating federal discrimination laws and DOT regulations. You have no union. Your stock options are voided upon termination for gross misconduct. And as for your lawyers, I welcome them to try. I have a legal team that takes up 3 floors of a skyscraper in Manhattan. We will bury you in litigation until you are bankrupt." Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute finality of Arthur's words crushed the last remaining breath of his ego. The house of cards he had built on a foundation of arrogance and favoritism had completely collapsed in less than 5 minutes. "Now," Arthur continued, gesturing toward the heavy duffel bags resting at David's feet. Since you are no longer an employee of Global Horizon Airlines, you have no security clearance to be in a sterile boarding area. However, before you leave, you are going to pick up Mr. and Mrs. Hayes's luggage, and you are going to carry it back onto that aircraft and place it exactly where you found it. Richard stared at the bags as if they were venomous snakes. I am not a skycap. I will not carry their bags. You will carry their bags, or I will press charges against you for fraud, harassment, and the unlawful eviction of ticketed passengers, Arthur promised, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. And I will personally ensure that the video Mr. Hayes recorded of your little power trip is leaked to every major news outlet in the country by dinner time. You will never work in corporate America again. The threat of public ruin was the final blow. Richard's shoulders slumped. The arrogant, posturing executive vanished, replaced by a defeated, broken man. Slowly, humiliatingly, he reached down and picked up the 2 heavy duffel bags. Good, Arthur said, stepping aside. He looked at David and Sarah. The anger in David's eyes had been replaced by profound shock, and Sarah was wiping away a tear, holding her children close. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, Arthur addressed them, his tone softening dramatically. I cannot undo the terror and frustration you experienced today. No family should ever be treated the way you were treated on an aircraft bearing my company's name. But I beg you, please allow me to make this right. Your seats are waiting for you. David looked at his wife. They communicated volumes in a single glance. They had stood their ground, they had faced the worst of corporate bullying, and they had miraculously won. David nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Kensington, David said, his voice thick with emotion. We appreciate you stepping in. It is the very least I can do, Arthur replied. Please, after you. The procession back onto the aircraft was a surreal reversal of fortune. David, Sarah, Chloe, and Leo walked down the jet bridge, heads held high. Trailing behind them, struggling under the weight of the heavy canvas bags, was Richard Sterling, his face burning with a fiery, shameful red. Bringing up the rear was Arthur Kensington, keeping a watchful eye on the disgraced manager. As they re-entered the first-class cabin, the passengers who had witnessed the initial eviction stared in stunned silence. Jessica, the flight attendant, let out an audible gasp of joy when she saw the Hayes family return. Richard unceremoniously dropped the bags near row 2. He wouldn't look at David or Sarah. He just stared at the floor. Your keycard, your radio, and your corporate identification, Mr. Sterling. Right now, Arthur demanded softly, holding out his hand. Trembling, Richard reached into his pockets. He unclipped his security badge, handed over his 2-way radio, and pulled his corporate credit card from his wallet. He placed them in Arthur's open palm. Officer Miller, Arthur called back to the jet bridge door. The burly police officer stepped onto the aircraft. This man is officially trespassing on private property. Please escort him out of the airport. Ensure he does not access any employee areas on his way out. With pleasure, sir, Officer Miller replied. He walked up to Richard and grasped him firmly by the elbow. Let's go, pal. You're walking out through the public terminal. As Richard was marched off the plane, he glanced back toward the jet bridge, hoping to find some semblance of support from his wealthy friends. But Greg and Diane Whitmore were already marching furiously up the ramp toward the concourse, arguing loudly with each other, completely abandoning the man who had just destroyed his own life for their convenience. Richard was entirely alone. With the antagonist removed, the atmosphere in the cabin instantly lifted. Jessica rushed over to the Hayes family, her face glowing. I am so sorry about all of that, she whispered to Sarah. I tried to tell him you were legitimate. "We know you did, Jessica." "Thank you." Sarah smiled warmly. "Are we still going to London, Mummy?" Leo asked, his big brown eyes looking up from his seat. "Yes, baby." Sarah kissed his forehead. "We are going to London." Arthur remained standing in the aisle until the family was settled. He leaned down slightly, resting his hands on the partition of David's pod. "David, Sarah," Arthur began, using their first names for the first time. "As I mentioned, I acquired this company to fix it. Today, you showed me exactly how deep the rot goes. When we land in London, my personal assistant will be waiting for you at the arrival gate. I have taken the liberty of upgrading your accommodations for the entirety of your 2-week stay. You will be staying at the Kensington Grand Hotel in Mayfair in the penthouse suite, entirely on my dime." David's jaw dropped. "Arthur, that's incredibly generous, but you really don't have to do that." "I insist." Arthur smiled, a genuine, warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Furthermore, my private car service will be at your disposal for the duration of your trip, and I've arranged for private tours of the Tower of London and the Natural History Museum for Chloe and Leo. Consider it a sincere apology for the incompetence of my former management." Sarah was overwhelmed. We don't know what to say. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank you for holding your ground," Arthur said. "Oh, and one more thing. I'm having Brenda at the gate flag your loyalty profiles. From this day forward, you hold lifetime Chairman's Circle status. Whenever you fly Vanguard or Global Horizon, anywhere in the world, you fly first class, for free, for the rest of your lives." Before David or Sarah could even process the magnitude of the gift, Arthur tipped an imaginary hat to them and walked back to his seat in 1A. He sat down, pulled out a small leather notebook, and began writing furiously. The restructuring of Vanguard Aviation wasn't going to start next week. It had just started today in the heart of Chicago O'Hare. A few minutes later, the heavy aircraft doors were secured. The captain's voice came over the intercom, apologizing for the brief delay and announcing their imminent departure. As the massive Boeing 777 pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, David reached across the aisle and took Sarah's hand. The nightmare had evaporated, replaced by a surreal, miraculous dream. Far below them, walking through the crowded, chaotic expanse of Terminal 5, Richard Sterling was doing the walk of shame. Surrounded by thousands of travelers, flanked by a stern-faced police officer, Richard carried a small cardboard box containing the personal contents of his desk, which another officer had hastily gathered. People stared at him. Some pointed. He kept his head down, the reality of his devastating fall from grace crashing over him in waves. He had traded his career, his reputation, and his livelihood for a fleeting moment of petty arrogance. As the jet engines roared to life above the airport, carrying the Hayes family toward the vacation of a lifetime, Richard stepped out through the sliding glass doors into the muggy Chicago afternoon. He had no job, no friends, and no power. Karma had not just knocked on his door, it had kicked it off the hinges. At 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, the cabin of Global Horizon Flight 402 was a sanctuary of hushed luxury. The ambient lighting had dimmed to a soft starlit blue, and the gentle hum of the twin Rolls-Royce engines provided a soothing lullaby. In row 2, Chloe and Leo were fast asleep in their lie-flat beds, wrapped in plush, monogrammed duvets, completely oblivious to the historical corporate execution they had just witnessed. David and Sarah, however, were wide awake. They sat in their respective pods, nursing glasses of sparkling water, still processing the sheer magnitude of the afternoon. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Sarah whispered across the aisle, reaching out to graze David's fingertips. "Things like this, They don't happen to us. The bad guy never actually gets fired on the spot. We usually just get an automated apology email 3 weeks later and a $200 flight voucher." David nodded slowly, staring at the darkened entertainment screen. "Arthur Kensington. I looked him up on the in-flight Wi-Fi while you were in the lavatory. He's a phantom. He's worth over $14 billion, made his fortune in aggressive acquisitions, and is famous for absolutely gutting toxic corporate boards. Richard Sterling picked literally the worst human being on the planet to flex his authority in front of." "Thank God he was there," Sarah sighed, leaning back against her pillows. "But what about Richard? A guy like that doesn't just go quietly. He's going to try and spin this." Sarah's instincts were chillingly accurate, though neither she nor Richard Sterling could have predicted the sheer speed of the digital age. 4,000 miles behind them, in the sprawling metropolis of Chicago, Richard Sterling was sitting on the edge of a sleek, minimalist Italian leather sofa in his luxury Gold Coast condominium. His tie was loosened, his designer jacket was crumpled on the floor, and a half-empty glass of scotch sat on the glass coffee table in front of him. His mind was racing, desperately trying to construct a narrative that would save his skin. He picked up his smartphone, his fingers trembling slightly. He needed to get ahead of the story. He needed to control the damage before Arthur Kensington's corporate hounds descended upon him. First, he dialed Greg Whitmore. He needed his wealthy friend to back up his story, to claim that the Hayes family was acting belligerent and that Richard was simply maintaining order. The phone rang 5 times before going to voicemail. Richard cursed under his breath and dialed Diane Whitmore's number. It went straight to a generic answering machine. The Whitmores were ghosting him. Panic began to claw at his throat. He scrolled through his contacts, finally landing on the number of Maxwell Finch, a high-priced, morally flexible employment lawyer he had kept on retainer for years to handle minor HR disputes. "Max, it's Richard," he barked into the receiver as soon as the line connected. "I have a crisis. I need you to draft a cease and desist letter immediately. Send it to a passenger named David Hayes. He illegally recorded me on a commercial aircraft. I want to threaten a massive defamation suit to keep him quiet. Then, I need you to look at my Vanguard Aviation contract. The new owner just tried to terminate me verbally without severance." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. When Maxwell finally spoke, his tone was devoid of its usual sycophantic warmth. "Richard, have you checked the internet in the last hour?" Maxwell asked cautiously. "No, I've been busy trying to salvage my life." "Why?" "A cease and desist isn't going to do you any good, Richard. David Hayes didn't upload any video," Maxwell explained, the sound of keyboard clacking echoing through the phone. "But the businessman sitting across the aisle from them in row 3 did. He recorded the entire altercation from his seat, the illegal eviction, the threats, your interaction with the billionaire, all of it. He posted it to X and TikTok 45 minutes ago." The blood drained from Richard's face. "How bad is it?" "It has 4 million views and counting," Maxwell said grimly. "It's the #1 trending topic worldwide. They are calling you the O'Hare oligarch. The hashtags #boycott global horizon and #justice for the Hayes are everywhere. But here is the worst part, Richard. Vanguard Aviation just released an official statement. Read it," Richard demanded, his voice cracking. It says, "Vanguard Aviation Group, under the new ownership of Kensington Holdings, confirms the immediate termination of Regional Director Richard Sterling for gross misconduct, discriminatory behavior, and severe violation of company policy. Mr. Sterling's actions do not reflect our values. We have personally apologized to the affected family and compensated them. Vanguard maintains a zero-tolerance policy for abuse of power. Maxwell took a deep breath. Richard, you are toxic waste right now. I can't represent you. If I touch this case, my firm will be boycotted. Good luck. The line went dead. Richard dropped his phone. It clattered against the glass coffee table. He slowly reached forward and grabbed the television remote, turning on a local Chicago news channel. There, on the screen, was the grainy, vertically shot cell phone footage. Richard watched in horror as his own face filled the screen, twisted in an ugly, condescending sneer. He heard his own voice echoing through his living room. Look, let's not make a scene in front of the proper clientele in this cabin. Perhaps a budget carrier would better suit your family's travel style. The news anchor cut back to the studio, her expression grim. A shocking display of arrogance and alleged profiling at O'Hare today. The executive in the video, Richard Sterling, has already been fired by the airline's new billionaire owner, Arthur Kensington, who was remarkably sitting just feet away during the incident. Adding insult to injury, prominent Chicago socialites Greg and Diane Whitmore, who were given the family's seats, have just released a statement via their publicist. The screen flashed to a PR graphic. Richard leaned in, his heart pounding against his ribs. The statement read, "We are deeply disturbed and horrified by the footage of Richard Sterling's actions. We were led to believe by Mr. Sterling that there was a legitimate ticketing error. Had we known a family was being unjustly removed, we would never have accepted the seats. We condemn Mr. Sterling's behavior in the strongest possible terms and have severed all personal and professional ties with him." The betrayal was absolute. The Whitmores, the very people Richard had destroyed his career to impress, had completely thrown him to the wolves to protect their own pristine public image. They had known exactly what was happening on that jet bridge, but now they were playing the victims. Richard buried his face in his hands. He was utterly, hopelessly ruined. The six-figure salary, the stock options, the prestige, the country club memberships, all of it vanished in the span of 3 hours. He had built his entire identity around his corporate superiority, and now he was a global pariah. The descent into London Heathrow was exceptionally smooth, the heavy aircraft piercing through the typical grey British clouds to reveal the sprawling, historic city below. As the plane taxied to the gate, Arthur Kensington stood up from seat 1A, gathered his worn leather briefcase, and offered a polite nod to the flight crew. He didn't wait for the Hayes family. He had orchestrated their reception and preferred to slip away quietly into the morning mist, his work already shifting to the massive corporate cleanup awaiting him. When David, Sarah, and the children stepped off the aircraft, they were met immediately at the end of the jet bridge by a tall, impeccably dressed man holding an iPad with the name Hayes displayed in bold, elegant typography. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes?" the man inquired with a crisp, polite British accent. "Welcome to London. My name is Thomas. Mr. Kensington sent me to ensure your arrival is completely seamless. Please follow me." Thomas led them past the winding, massive queues of the standard customs checkpoint and directly into a private, VIP diplomatic clearance lounge. Within 10 minutes, their passports were stamped. Their luggage, the very same bags Richard Sterling had been forced to carry, was loaded onto a silver, extended wheelbase Range Rover waiting on the tarmac, and they were gliding toward central London. The Kensington Grand Hotel in Mayfair was a testament to old-world luxury. As they pulled up to the entrance, the doormen, already briefed on their arrival, greeted them by name. They bypassed the front desk entirely and were escorted straight to the private elevator, which deposited them into the penthouse suite. Sarah gasped as the doors opened. The suite was larger than their home in Chicago. It featured panoramic views of Hyde Park, a grand piano, a private dining room, and a massive fruit basket alongside a bottle of vintage champagne. On the marble kitchen island sat a handwritten note on thick cardstock. David picked it up and read it aloud to Sarah. "David and Sarah, I hope the remainder of your journey was peaceful. Please enjoy London to the absolute fullest. True power is not found in a title, but in how one treats those who have none. You protected your children's dignity yesterday, and that is worth more than any first-class ticket. Enjoy the chairman's circle. Arthur." While the Hayes family began the vacation of their dreams, basking in the ultimate unexpected reward for their quiet endurance, the nightmare was just beginning for Richard Sterling. The Monday morning following the incident, Arthur Kensington walked into the towering glass and steel headquarters of Vanguard Aviation Group in downtown Chicago. He did not wear a suit. He wore his standard tweed jacket and khakis. The atmosphere in the executive suites was thick with terror. Every vice president, director, and senior manager had seen the viral video over the weekend. They knew the Reaper was in the building. Arthur called a mandatory all-hands meeting in the main boardroom. He stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, his piercing blue eyes scanning the nervous faces of the corporate elite. "This company," Arthur began, his voice dangerously quiet, "has a cultural cancer. I witnessed it firsthand on Friday. I watched a senior executive treat paying customers like disposable garbage to curry favor with his wealthy friends. And worse, I saw a system that empowered him to do it. The gate agents were terrified of him. The flight crew was threatened by him. That ends today." Arthur spent the next 3 hours systematically cleaning house. He fired the Vice President of Human Resources for ignoring years of complaints regarding Richard Sterling's toxic management style. He dissolved the Platinum Elite priority overriding system, instituting a strict, transparent policy that forbade the involuntary removal of boarded revenue passengers under any circumstances, heavily fining any manager who attempted it. Then he made a phone call to O'Hare Terminal 5. He ordered the immediate promotion of Brenda, the gate agent who had tried to stand up to Richard. She was given a substantial raise and moved to corporate headquarters to spearhead a new training program focused entirely on passenger advocacy and de-escalation. But Arthur wasn't finished with Richard Sterling. Firing him wasn't enough. The billionaire wanted to make an example of him that would echo through the aviation industry for a decade. 2 weeks later, as the Hayes family was packing their bags in London to return home, rested, joyful, and completely unburdened, a process server knocked on the door of Richard Sterling's Gold Coast condo. Richard answered the door looking 10 years older. He hadn't shaved in days, and his eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights and endless rejected job applications. The process server handed him a thick stack of legal documents. "You've been served, Mr. Sterling," the man said flatly, before turning away. Richard opened the file. It was a lawsuit filed by Kensington Holdings and Vanguard Aviation Group. They were suing him for gross breach of fiduciary duty, massive brand damage resulting in the loss of thousands of ticket sales due to the viral boycott and the misappropriation of company resources. They were seeking $10 million in damages. Accompanying the lawsuit was a court order freezing all of Richard's financial assets, his investment portfolios, and his retirement accounts, pending the resolution of the trial. Arthur Kensington had kept his promise. His skyscraper full of Manhattan lawyers had descended. Richard staggered backward into his apartment, the legal papers slipping from his hands and scattering across the hardwood floor. He couldn't afford a defense attorney. Maxwell Finch had already abandoned him, and no reputable firm would touch a man with his frozen assets and toxic public profile. He would have to sell the condo just to pay the legal retaining fees, provided the court even allowed him to liquidate the property. Over the next 6 months, the mighty Richard Sterling was completely dismantled. He was forced to sell his luxury car and move out of the Gold Coast into a tiny, cramped apartment in the suburbs. His friends, in the upper echelons of Chicago society, pretended they had never met him. Desperate for income, he applied for a mid-level managerial position at a notoriously cheap, ultra-low-cost regional carrier operating out of a secondary airport. During the interview, the hiring manager, a young woman in her 20s, looked at his resume, then looked up at him with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Mr. Sterling," she said, sliding his resume back across the desk, "we are a budget airline, yes, but we still have standards. We cannot hire the O'Hare oligarch. The PR nightmare alone would ruin us. I suggest you look outside of the aviation industry entirely." Richard walked out of that interview, the cold Chicago wind biting through his cheap, off-the-rack coat. He stood at the bus stop, his first time taking public transit in 20 years, and looked up at the sky. A massive global horizon. Boeing 777 soared overhead, catching the afternoon sunlight. Inside that plane, or one just like it, David and Sarah Hayes were likely sitting comfortably in row 2, sipping champagne, recognized and respected by a crew that had been trained to treat every single passenger with the dignity they inherently deserved. Karma had not just balanced the scales, it had shattered them entirely, proving that arrogance is a fragile fortress, easily toppled by the quiet, unyielding power of integrity. The story of the Hayes family and Richard Sterling serves as a stark reminder that true power is never derived from a title, but rather from the content of one's character. Hubris and unchecked privilege blind individuals to their own fragility, leading them to believe they can manipulate the world without consequence. Richard Sterling's devastating downfall illustrates that the universe has a profound, often poetic mechanism for delivering justice. By targeting a family based on prejudice, he inadvertently dismantled his own life. Conversely, David and Sarah's steadfast refusal to surrender their dignity in the face of bullying rewarded them beyond measure. Arthur Kensington's intervention underscores a vital truth. Integrity must be enforced from the top down. Ultimately, cruelty is a debt that always comes due, and respect is the only currency that retains its value in the turbulence of life.